But hold on to your hats, ladies and gentlemen. I think this session is going to be quite a roller coaster. Jan, welcome.
Thank you, Ian. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Sorry we can't be together. I love that video, man. Remember when we were 1 foot apart, no mask, taking sushi with our bare hands. Wow, remember those days. So I look forward to doing that soon again in person. Let me share my screen and my slides here. And let's start. So it's been tough, This is unprecedented is the word that we're using all the time, but the data points that I'm showing you that you've been living with are indeed something we've never seen before. So it's sort of hard to make sense out of the data when it's so dismal. I was with you a year ago and I shared, 5 predictions for the 2020s and talked about Amazon, talked about climate change, talked about cleaning fees, and then I was looking for a 5th one, and I'm like, well, we're sort of in this very long run, the longest uninterrupted RevPAR growth cycle we've ever seen. So I'm like, well, let me just predict there'll be a recession because, I'm probably going to be right in the 2020s. And I said, look, ADRs are going to, drop pretty sharply. Little did I know that I would actually be correct so quickly. Indeed, 60 days later, you see here that this is the ADR performance for the United States. And in April, indeed, RevPAR dropped by 45%, and then it got a little bit better. I don't want to say better, maybe a little less bad, going forward. And then when we fast forward to the world, what I'm showing you here is the RevPAR percent change for the year by region. And we introduced something new in this environment because the data was, well, unprecedented and we had a lot of hotels close. We were asked, hey, don't show us your standard calculation of occupancy and RevPAR. Show it to us as if all rooms were open, what we call total room inventory. And of course, when you have the denominator goes up, that means that the occupancy has to go down, right? So you're seeing here that the occupancy and the RevPAR are much worse if you take all rooms into consideration. But look at these numbers, right? I mean, it's in North America, RevPAR down 50%, South America 70%, Europe down 70%. Australia down, Oceania down 50%, and mainland China doing quote unquote better, where RevPAR for the year only declined 36% if you look at the standard methodology. So these are crazy numbers. So let me talk to you a little bit about where the US is today. We'll talk a little bit about the classes, the segmentation, the interplay of group versus transient, then the pipeline, and then the forecast. This is very much in line with the presentation I gave 2 years ago, when, everything was great. And last year, you all knew it was great, so I had to make up some other stuff, so I predicted a recession. I'm not predicting a recession anymore because we're luckily done with that. So, well, we're hopefully done with that. We're going to continue to move forward with very positive percent changes, as you will see in the forecast. So this is the chart that tells the story in the United States, right? This is the monthly RevPAR percent change from same month prior year back to 1990. And you're seeing the last 3 recessions. And you're also seeing that the trough, the worst month of each recession, if you add them all together, it was not as bad as April of this year. We obviously STR was bought by CoStar, and we have a lot of economists on staff, and one of them talked about the year that broke the charts. And that's very much what this looks like. It's going to be very hard going forward to make these charts legible because you have these but you have these very severe outliers. So this is what it looks like when you zoom in. So in April, RevPAR declined by 80%. So forget revenue per available room. Just think about revenues, right? The revenues for the American hotel industry declined by 80%, an industry-wide decline. The week of April the 11th was the single worst week we've ever recorded, where RevPAR declined 84%. And since then, you see that actually the increases are getting, I don't know, better, but it went from 80 to -70 to -60 to -50, so a 10-point improvement. As the summer continued, Americans took to the road, the great caravan of 2020. Everybody hopped into their car and drove, and what used to be drive-to markets that were 2 or 4 hours away suddenly were 12 or 14 hours away, right? You had people drive from New York to Nashville, from Nashville to Yosemite, and that wasn't a big deal, because people just wanted to get away to the wide open spaces. We get the question a lot, as I said before, about what does the occupancy look like? And we've always delivered the occupancy in our standard model, right? Rooms sold divided by rooms available. But because you have so many rooms closed, the question is, what does the occupancy look like if we indeed take full availability, total room inventory, into consideration? These are the two occupancies. I will sprinkle these throughout the presentation, but just know that the percent change between TRI and standard has to be mathematically the number of rooms sold. So today in December, 3.3% of all rooms in the United States are indeed still closed, very much skewed towards the upper end, as we'll show in a minute. So let's talk about the classes specifically. Whoa, okay. So, well, if you are a full service box with lots of ballrooms and lots of restaurants, you got hit disproportionately harder. Your RevPAR declined by 60%. If you were a very high-end luxury hotel, your RevPAR still declined by 50%. If you were an economy class hotel, maybe located at a highway, your RevPAR only declined by 30%. The absolute levels of occupancy are just staggering, right? You see on the right-hand side that the upper mid-scale and economy class hotels are sort of in the 40s, maybe throw upscale in there as well. But for upper upscale and luxury, 35%, call it a third of the rooms are occupied. 2/3 of the rooms are empty, in 2020, and compare that obviously to 2019. Well, maybe you don't want to compare that to 2019, but it's too depressing. But the point here is that the full service boxes get disproportionately impacted because of the lack of corporate transient and of corporate group demand. It's going to be interesting to see when CEOs will allow staff back on the road, on the transient side, and more importantly for the industry, when we have group meetings again. So then again, let's look at the TRI occupancy just to get a sense of what is actually the amount of closed properties. And what you're seeing here is on the right-hand side, upper mid-scale economy, you see the percent difference, -1.9, -1.2, 0.7, that basically for those classes, all rooms are open, right? But then on the upper end, we almost have 10% of full service boxes still closed, and some of them won't make it. Some of them will be permanently closed. Now, the asterisk to that story, of course, is they're permanently closed until they are not. So you read a lot about high-profile properties in New York City, for example, being closed, but I do not think that those will be actually closed forever. They're closed by the current owner forever until that entity sells it, and then somebody else may step in and open it again. Segmentation, and this is just brutal. So the group RevPAR percent change in April declined 94%. I always say there were no groups, and that's not totally true, but it's basically true. And you see on the far right-hand side that the data hasn't really recovered. That RevPAR, group RevPAR is still down, 85% or so. So throughout the summer, when there was some signs of life on the transient side, there really was nothing, or nothing that moved the needle on the group side. Indeed, though, and this I think is super fascinating, in August, September, October, November, we sold over 1 million group rooms, right? So when there was no group demand, we still sold over 1 million group rooms. And so I was like, I was wondering the way you're wondering, like, who are these groups? So I talked to some, local directors of sales here in Nashville, where I'm based, and I'm like, okay, what is this? And they said, look, Jan, there are weddings. They're just tiny. There are soccer teams, there are youth baseball teams that are still traveling, which now can't afford a very nice hotel because those hotels are basically empty. So there are very random, what we call Smurf, right, groups that are there. It's just not this big corporate piece that's missing. Add to that little side note here. This is not our data, this is from trade.gov, but the number of international travelers just cratered, right? So the scale is at 100,000. So it's 2.8 million, call it 3 million in January. It's a tenth of that in November, and in April, it was, what is that, 20,000? I mean, really nothing, So this is going to hurt the big boxes in the coasts for much, much, much longer, right? And you heard about, the administration is saying, look, you need to have a negative test if you want to come in if you want to board a plane to get into the U.S. All of this is not going to help this number. Now, I applaud that we're doing this, but just know that there's not going to be a lot of movement on the international visitation data. And then this is slightly different, but exactly the same story. As you know, we break out the United States in the top 25 largest lodging markets, excluding Las Vegas, and basically everything else. And this is just to show that, oh, wow, because the top 25 markets have a disproportionate share of the full service big box hotels, they, of course, got hit hard as well. And you see that, the RevPAR, in December was still down 65% for the year, well worse than the nation. And then a quick look, because we get this question quite a bit from investors anyways, what's going on in specific markets, and can you tell us the closure rate in those markets that we, the investors, care about a lot? And you see here on the right-hand side is the difference, meaning the closure rate, and on the left-hand side is the absolute level of occupancy, either standard or TRI. And the point here is like, oh, wow, in New York City, a third of the rooms are closed. In San Francisco, a quarter of the rooms are closed. In, what is that, Chicago, Oahu, Washington, 10% of the rooms are temporarily closed. Now, will that be like that forever? No. I mean, some of them, my understanding is the Marriott Wardman Park in DC is actually going to completely get nuked, and they're going to make it into condos, But some of the properties, like the Novotel in Times Square, closed. But in the press release, the owner said, "Oh yeah, we're closing it, but we're making it something else." So the Novotel closes forever, but there will be a new hotel in its place. A brief look at the pipeline data. Not a big surprise, right? The number of rooms in construction today, December 2020, is lower than it was in December of 2019. Why is that? Well, it's because the properties that are being built are opening, right? We still had in 2020 1,000 properties open. Sorry, in 2019, I'm sorry. There were 1,000 hotels that opened, So that's a lot of hotels, right? So we will see those 197,000 rooms open. I don't think that there's any doubt about that. It is in nobody's interest to put a tarp over a half-built building. That's just not done. It was done once in Vegas, where they're building the Drew right now. That was actually literally they put a tarp over it. But again, that's being newly constructed again. But so the number of rooms in construction will decline because rooms are opening. But then rooms are not moving from final planning and planning into in construction. So we think, we have the distinct sense that the projects that are where you have a plan and an architecture drawing and maybe talking to some brands about their franchise agreement, that you're saying, you know what, I'm not sure I can make this happen. And then you talk to a banker who's saying, absolutely, I'm not going to give you any money. Have you seen the STR data? So we think that the in construction pipeline is going to continue to decelerate throughout 2020. And we're saying this because if history is any guide, the previous peak was December of 2007, right before the prior recession, and then the number of rooms in construction decelerated to just over 50,000. Now, this time around, I think there is light at the end of the tunnel earlier. I think in 2008 and 9, we didn't know if we would have a banking system. We didn't know how this would end. Here, we know exactly how this ends, right? We know it ends with vaccinations. So this may not be as sharp a drop as we've seen, but there will be a decline. And what are we building? I show this chart every year, and it doesn't change any year. 71%, 7 out of 10 rooms are limited service, and we're building very, very few full service boxes. This has not changed. If you've seen me present in the last couple of years, this is exactly the same chart. The individual numbers may change, but the ratio does not. And then, not a big surprise, I'm just telling you something you probably expected. Projects move to either deferred or move to abandoned from these other two phases, final planning and planning. No big surprise, right? That number is increasing. On the final planning and planning movement to abandoned, let's just be very clear. If somebody signs a franchise agreement or breaks ground or buys land, they send us a press release. They're like, look, we're going to do something cool. Do they send us a press release if they abandon a project? Nope. So I would think this is actually an undercount of the projects that are being abandoned. So stay tuned for that. We're obviously constantly talking to owners and developers, but I really wonder if those projects that are deferred, that some of them will move over to abandoned. And then just to put that chart that I showed 2 charts ago into context, so because 70% of rooms are limited service, we're not building full service hotels, which also means we're building less meeting space, which then also means that in the future, as we recover, meeting space will be hard to come by, and this is a really interesting conundrum, for hotel owners today, because they know there are no groups, but in the future, there'll be very little competition or very limited competition, so this could be a very interesting place to be if you can make it through, because there's just fewer meeting space, less meeting space available, and obviously if we expect the recovery to happen, there will be meetings again. Lastly, let's talk about the forecast. So this is with our friends from Tourism Economics, Adam Sachs, who runs the shop over there, and has come up with these numbers and with these thoughts. So number one, arguably, we already started the initial recovery because last summer, people hopped in their cars, right? Domestic leisure, drive to, and some fly to business. Although if you look at the TSA data, which is readily available, and I hope you're looking at that, not a whole lot of demand other than Thanksgiving and Christmas. And those people arguably stayed either in Airbnbs or stayed on their mom's couch and not in hotel rooms. Second phase begins Q2. Maybe that's a little optimistic. Some medium events, regional, international. So this is Canada, Mexico, US, but not a lot of long haul. And then arguably once vaccinations have hit their stride, in June, July, August, hopefully after Labor Day, we see some more large events and people are comfortable again, grabbing sushi with their bare hands 2 feet away from somebody else without a mask on. Although I think masks are going to be with us for a long, long time. This is the forecast data slide. There's a lot going on here. Don't write this down. This is going to be available to you after class. I'm just saying, look, room demand declined last year by 36%. And yes, it's going to come back, but quote unquote, only by 18%. And then next year, even better, by 25% when groups are really coming back in full force. What's noteworthy and scary on this chart is that room rates declined last year by over 20%, and this year they're only going up by 4%. Next year, we're doubling that to 8%. But think about this. This year, there's still really no pricing power, which means there's really limited money to be made that falls down to the EBITDA line, which means owners are still going to be in dire straits. The RevPAR forecast, 21%, 22%, call that growth, is of course the single strongest year we've ever recorded, only to be eclipsed in 2022. And if these percentages don't make your head spin, maybe this does. So this is actually doing the math for you. So the occupancy last year was 42%. This year, it's still sub 50. Next year, we're finally back to 60. But keep in mind that 2019, it was 66%. And those last 6 points is where pricing power resides. And since we don't have those, there's going to be very limited pricing power. You see that the room rates increasing very, very, very marginally. So then the question is, all right, Jan, this was all interesting-ish, but when are we back? When are we back to 2019 levels? And I'm only showing you here room demand and ADR, just to make the point that, look, we expect that room demand in the United States will meet 2019 levels in 2023, but that ADR will not hit 2019 levels in this forecast horizon, which is 2024, implying it's going to be 2025. So this is a demand first, ADR second recovery, which it always is. This is not a surprise. This is the way the recoveries play out, demand first, ADR second. But the ADR decline last year was so severe that it's going to take us 5 years to get back to 2019 levels. So with that said, I appreciate your time, and let me stop broadcasting and happy to take any questions you may have.
Perfect. Thank you, Jan. Appreciate that. I think I'll just do a very quick plug for the data analytics session, which is coming up, because I think based on what you've just seen, knowing how to react to data and how to stay a little bit agile coming through the next couple of years is going to be really important. So,
yep, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for sharing the insight, Jan. I think I mentioned it'll be a roller coaster. It certainly feels like it. So from a personal perspective, rightly or wrongly, I live in New York, and I made the decision to stay in New York this whole time, right? So you talk about the Novotel Times Square. Like, I live 2 blocks away from Times Square. I've genuinely seen firsthand some of the challenges that you've talked us through in the last 20 minutes or so. But I couldn't help thinking as you were going through it, like if I'm operating a property in the mountains of Tennessee or the beaches of North Carolina, I'm probably sitting there watching you do this and think, oh, I'm not seeing quite the same, right? I may have had a really good summer last year, but what do we know about the difference between urban versus non-urban trends?
Yeah, absolutely. Tale of two cities. There's full service. I think the 3 sort of trends that came out of the summer of 2020 was drive to over fly to, suburban over urban, and limited service over full service. Those are sort of the 3 main themes that emerged in the data and that we saw when we talked to your colleagues, our colleagues, and clients. So you're correct that if you had access to wide open spaces, that made people feel safer. So Wyoming, the Dakotas, Utah did really well. And people drove there, for like 15 hours because they're like, I don't trust anybody, I know my bubble, this is my car, and they went. We actually expect something very similar this summer, this late spring, early summer. I have, rightly or wrongly, this odd feeling that the American consumer cares about the virus, but doesn't really. I mean, what we saw, I think was a little counterintuitive that people indeed, as the virus started, people said, well, I don't want to fly and maybe I don't want to stay in a hotel. But you saw that Airbnb did really well, right? Like you can rent a place, a home, VRBO did well. And people said, I want to go somewhere, and so virus be damned, people still went. And I think now that it's in the psyche, the psychology that, oh, we have vaccines, I think people will again take a road trip late spring, early summer, especially if they can continue to work from anywhere, as we are in knowledge workers. And if schools are still on Zoom, you just pack your kids up again, and go somewhere. So that's sort of my sense of the summer, but we really, really, really are looking forward to the latter part of the year, Q3 Labor Day, when we think that the urban markets will also come back when corporate transient comes back. But I totally agree with you. I think access to nature ruled and will continue to.
So based on that, it kind of leads to the question that says, last year was a complete unknown for a lot of people. Yes, people drove further, people went for the open space, but one of the impacts that everybody saw was a booking window on the floor, basically. Everything was coming in last minute, right? Are people approaching 2021 with a bit more foresight and knowledge, right? So you're already talking about the summer or the spring breaks coming. Are we likely to see booking windows change, or do you think people are going to still be very last minute decision makers in 2021?
So I think it's going to be a tale of two cities. I think there's going to be a very distinct difference. There's going to be we think that the high end is going to do well or very well, because the people who can afford the high end travel in 2020 may have just sat at home and said, you know what, I'm not quite sure. Let me just save all this money. I wanted to go to Italy. I wanted to take the cruise. I wanted to go to the 5-star resort. Let me just keep it. And now they have more money to spend on experiences. So in 2021, they can be like, look, late summer, I may have my vaccine. I'm the grandparent. I want to see my grandkids again. I will have my vaccination shots. If I'm over 65, you probably definitely have them. Let's hope that my kids who are in their 40s have them as well. Let's all get together and let's just splurge. Let's just be together, get a villa, get a couple of suites, whatever, and do it right and just celebrate that we're back out again. So we think that is one part of the equation. So they will book it, and they will book it today, basically, for the late summer, for the fall. But then there will be, of course, I don't know, is there going to be a mutation? Is there going to be, other sort of curveballs that were being thrown in? So let me just sit on the sidelines and do something for next weekend. So I think we're going to see, for all other hotel classes other than luxury, I think it's still going to be a very, very crunched booking window, but I would not be surprised if we see on the high end something very different.
Okay, great, thanks. I'm going to pick up on two things that you've mentioned as we've gone through. You mentioned the success of Airbnb and Vrbo. You also mentioned, just in that last piece of conversation, people going for villas, right? So there are questions clearly from the audience around that segment of our industry. One of the questions is simply said is alternative lodging here to stay? Another one talks about, what do we know about the impact of 2020 on that type of accommodation?
So is alternative lodging here to stay? Yes. We've always had it, right? If you go to Cape May, or if you go to the Carolinas, it was all, or whatever, the Colorado, ski areas, it was always alternative accommodations all the time. So I don't think that's new. I think the distribution mechanism is new and different, and maybe a little bit easier. It has the halo, of being a unicorn, or now a $100 billion unicorn. So yeah, that's here. Let me go back to 2019, right? And I think I used this exact line, when I got the question on stage, what's the impact of Airbnb? 2019, we sold more rooms than ever and had more rooms revenue than ever and the highest RevPAR ever. So I don't know what the impact was, because the hotel industry was firing all cylinders. Now, it's an education process, and can you make people feel safe being in lobbies and being in elevators? I feel that the hotel industry has done a great job, enforcing, masks, and which we all have one right now, and saying, look, only one person in the elevator, only one family in the elevator, 6 feet apart, all these decals. So I think the industry needs to continue that education process and make people feel safe about cleaning protocols. Going forward, will there be people who are saying, look, I was always a hotel client and now I'm only going to go to alternative accommodations? I don't know. I think the corporate business traveler, once their CEO and their travel manager and their CFO says, look, you're safe, we're safe, let's go back on the road. Yeah, we're going to stay downtown in the big Hilton, I'd married, whatever. Like, don't want to leave anybody out, but you know what I mean, like a full service upper upscale hotel. On the leisure side, I think maybe people, you know, got the idea, oh, this is actually a nice thing. But you're messing the service, right? You have to make your own bed and you have to cook your own meals. And there is something nice to be said after being at home for a year where you made your own bed and cooked your own meals to say, hey, I'm willing to pay somebody, anybody to do that for me.
Right now, I would take either option, honestly, and I think that's probably how a lot of people feel, right? So I think you're right. I think there's, you know, obviously at Booking, we saw an increase in the popularity of homes and apartments, specifically non-urban as well. But I think there's going to be a balance, and certainly I think somebody wanting full service is very valid, and somebody wanting space and privacy is also very valid. So I see them both coming back. There's a couple of questions about, specifically because you spoke around number of rooms closed, and you mentioned a couple of times some of these will close permanently. I think Yelp has reported 1 in 4 restaurants will probably remain closed permanently. And interestingly, I see that way higher in New York already.
Yeah.
But what do we know? Or is there any kind of guess around the percentage that's going to close?
No. So the American Hotel and Lodging Association came out in the middle of the year with a number that was, I'm making this up, did they say like 30% or something? I mean, it was an incredibly high number. And that just doesn't ring true to me, right? These are 20, 5, 10, 20, $30 million assets, you know, that have a lifespan of, you know, 30, 40, 50 years. Will they close? Yes, the owner may say, look, I can't make my debt service. I am done here. Will the bank then say, hey, you owed us $6 million on this. If I just get 6.1, I'm made whole, and I have a willing buyer, you know, who's going to then make this hotel something new. Will that happen? Absolutely. There's a ton of money on the sidelines, as there was in 2009, you know, of private equity funds, of debt funds, of you know, what they call runway capital funds, of people who are very, very interested in investing in this industry, especially with the vaccinations going on, because there's light at the end of the tunnel. You know, this too shall pass. There will be corporate transit, and there will be group meetings again. So on the restaurant side, a lot of restaurateurs, they just lease the space, right? They don't necessarily own the property. So they're like, well, I can't make my lease payment. The owner's like, well, you're out of here, and they're done, you know? But I think on the hotel side, owning the asset, you can do a lot of things with it if your entry point is right. And I think that's how I look at the world. You know, these press releases that come out and saying these hotels are closed, they're closed forever until they're not.
Right. So fast forward to whatever month we do our North American in-person conference in 2022. Obviously, we've got Miami coming up in October. Mm-hmm. The first words I want you to say on stage is, here's what I told you in 2021, this too shall pass, right? Because let's just use those words.
Yes. Eventually, I'll be right. Just keep inviting me. I will be right eventually.
So we asked you very specifically, this being the kind of North American version of the conference, we asked you very specifically to talk about US trends. We obviously have attendees across the world. Do you have any kind of insight into what you're seeing for recovery timescales for Europe? Like if you're talking about 2023 for demand in the US, like what's Europe? Is it earlier than that or later than that or the same?
So the sharp lockdowns, you know, obviously curtail occupancy. And then the question is, can hotels make it, even with some government assistance, can they make it through it? You know, hopefully vaccinations together with the lockdowns will decrease the spread, which then gets you out on the other side. like in China, or like I was interviewing somebody in Taiwan, and they said, well, we've had 7 cases in the last 7 months, and they came because somebody from another country came in, had an operation, infected the doctor, who then infected some nurses. But that was Taiwan. Like Taiwan, life is, from my understanding, business as usual. Same/opposite side of that is our Beijing bureau chief. Somebody went into their office complex, not her office complex on a Sunday, tested positive on Monday. On Monday afternoon, the government locked people in the office. They put up a rapid testing site outside, and they're like, you cannot go home. You're all in the office today. Come downstairs, get tested, go back to your office. And then on Tuesday morning at 5 a.m., they got the all clear and everybody left. So those are unfathomable interventions that could not stand in Europe or in the US. That is why China will recover faster, because our bureau chief, when we were texting, when she sent me these messages, she said, I am so thankful. I appreciate that. I'm like, wow, that is not necessarily the attitude you would get, in Western countries if you get locked into your office overnight. So I think the countries that take this seriously and take some drastic measures will come out a little bit earlier. It's going to be interesting to see with the mutations, because we can only lock down for so long, So I'm dancing around the answer. I don't have a good answer because it is still so murky. If the lockdowns work, and if the infection rates go down and vaccination rates go up, then yes, Europe could be on the earlier side of the recovery.
Great. Tim, thanks for asking the question. Nice to see you virtually as well. Let's see what we come up with from the European Day conferences. Maybe there'll be less murkiness around that time.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to go to the last question. I think you are wholly forgiven for not being 100% right on stage last year, given everything else that happened through the rest of the year, right? But one of the things I spoke to you about was, wait a second, if there's kind of pressure on ADRs not growing, how are people going to just make more money? And I think you used the word rooftops at the time, right? I think you basically just said, hey, invest more in your F&B and your rooftop and your bar services. Clearly that wasn't the right way to go in 2020, but what do we know? What do we know coming out of this, right? So restaurants are closed right now. You talked a little bit about the full service thing, but do you think like, as we start to recover, the use of facilities outside of sleeping rooms is going to become more important, or equally as important as it has been?
I think my answer was right last year. It was right in January and February. It wasn't right after that. So I think I'm changing my answer completely, and I am not talking to you about revenue generation. I'm talking to you about cost cutting. What I would not be surprised to see if that full service hotels become de facto limited service hotels, and that they're saying, look, we have 5 restaurants, we're gonna have 1, and it's gonna be a grab and go, and even if people get more comfortable, it's gonna be 1 sit down, but not all the venues,
Okay.
The catering, the banquets thing, it's going to be brown bag lunches. I mean, the amount of trash we're going to produce in the next 2, 3, 4 years. I understand that we want to keep her safe, but we're going to go back to plastic utensils, plastic everything. Yeah. The trash can in your room is not going to be big enough. Because if you have 2 meals, it's just gonna be overflowing. So I think this is going to be about pivoting and cutting costs more than figuring out where the revenues are. I mean, you always try to do both, but I think in this environment, we're going to look on the cost cutting side. And if you have a full service hotel that gets foreclosed on and the bank is like, hey, who wants it? And you have a new owner stepping in, I cannot imagine them on day 1 saying, hey, here is everything open. They're going to on day 1 say, bed and a bath for $1.50, and maybe a grab and go, even if it used to be a full service hotel. So that's going to be a super interesting thing to watch.
All right, audience. So what I heard there was carte blanche for me when I'm planning Miami to just serve all of our attendees grab and go brown bag lunches. So
and it may not be your call, you know, this may be what the attendees want, you know.
It's true.
Sushi with your hand next to somebody who doesn't wear a mask. Man, we're not going to see that in a long time.
There will certainly be different photos in our holding slides at the beginning of opening HEDNA in the future. That's true. Jan, I want to thank you, as always, for giving us your time this morning. Thank you for the insight. Thank you for sharing your perspective and the future. And we will move now to
Thank you very much.
produce the next session. But thanks again. Take care.
Thank you.